Even as he speaks, Maurice knows the truth that will haunt him until his own death. The king who ordered this atrocity is already in his grave. He died in glory, wrapped in silk sheets, shriven and blessed by priests who never dared ask the wrong questions, while beneath his palace, 50 women and their unborn children drowned in darkness, their screams unheard by God or man, their bodies left to rot in standing water that would hold its secrets for 150 years. But to understand how we arrived at this nightmare, how one man's appetite and absolute power created a tomb beneath a palace, we must journey back to the winter of 1197, to the coronation of a young man who believed himself above all earthly law, answerable only to God, and certain that God would never ask him to account for the blood of servants. The iron door stands between them, and answers they may not survive knowing. This door has not moved in 150 years, and it does not want to move now. 3 men strain against centuries of rust before the hinges surrender, with a shriek that tears through the palace undercroft. Bishop Maurice steps forward and raises his torch above the threshold. The flame gutters in the cold draught, and then the smell reaches them. Even after 150 years sealed behind stone and iron, the water in the chamber beneath carries the taint of death. The bishop's secretary covers his mouth while 2 palace guards turn away, but Maurice forces himself forward, descending into darkness. His torchlight plays across black water, perfectly still, and floating just beneath the surface lies something that makes his breath catch. Mother of God. His torch catches the curve of a skull, then another, then more, far too many to count. They rest beneath the water like stones in a riverbed. Small skulls and delicate bones tangled with the larger remains of women. The secretary descends behind him with his candle trembling. Your Grace, we should count them. Maurice's voice is cold as the water itself. Every single one. 3 hours pass in that flooded tomb, whispering prayers over remains that were never blessed. When they emerge into spring sunlight, the secretary's hand shakes so badly he can barely hold his parchment. 50 women, he reports with his voice breaking. Most were with child when they died. Maurice stares back at the sealed doorway. The records had prepared him for horror, but not this. Never this scale of calculated murder. He closes his eyes and thinks of the letter that brought him here. An old woman's confession on her deathbed. She had used the word drowning. She had spoken of screams in the night, of a king's rage, and a king's solution to an inconvenient truth. Maurice had not believed her. How could any man believe such horror possible? But now, standing in the courtyard of this abandoned palace, he understands with sick certainty that every word was true. Seal the chamber again, he orders. Send word to Rome. His Holiness must know what we have. Before we descend further into this darkness, join us to explore history's forbidden chapters weekly. Subscribe and press the bell. These stories don't appear in textbooks for a reason. To understand the horror that unfolded in that sealed chamber, we must first understand the world that made it possible. The year is 1197. France exists not as we know it today, but as a patchwork of territories held together by the brittle thread of royal authority. The Capetian dynasty sits on the throne claiming descent from Hugh Capet, who seized power 2 centuries before. But kingship in medieval France meant more than mere political power. The king was God's anointed representative on earth. At his coronation in the cathedral at Reims, holy oil touched his forehead, the same sacred chrism used on the heads of bishops. This wasn't ceremony, this was transformation. In the eyes of church and state, the king became something more than human. He could heal the sick with his touch. His word carried the weight of divine mandate, and his sins, many believed, could only be judged by God himself. This doctrine of divine right created a peculiar problem when it came to royal illegitimacy. A king's legitimate children inherited not just land and titles, but sacred authority. They carried royal blood sanctified by the church. But what of the children conceived outside marriage? In noble families, bastards might be acknowledged, even provided for. But for a king, illegitimate children represented something far more dangerous. They were living challenges to the legitimacy of the royal line itself. They carried royal blood without church sanction. They could become rallying points for rebellious nobles. They threatened the carefully constructed divine order that kept the king on his throne. Medieval legal scholars debated their status endlessly. Could a bastard inherit? Could they claim royal privilege? The answer was always no, but their very existence raised the question. Under feudal law, the king held absolute authority within his own domains. His palace was his kingdom in miniature. The servants who worked within its walls were not merely employees. They were his property in all but name. They served at his pleasure. They lived by his grace, and they could be disposed of by his command. The legal code of the time used the phrase haute justice, high justice, to describe the king's power to judge, sentence, and execute without appeal to any higher earthly authority. Marriage among palace servants required royal permission. Pregnancies were noted in household rolls tracked by the palace steward. Children born within the palace walls belonged, in a legal sense, to the household, which meant to the king himself. This created a complex web of obligation and control. A servant woman bore not just a child, but a potential claim against royal resources, royal charity, and royal conscience. The palace where our story unfolds stood in the Loire Valley, 3 days' ride south from Paris. Built a century earlier by the king's grandfather, it served as a favoured hunting lodge and summer residence. Its location was remote by design, far from the watchful eyes of the Paris clergy, distant from the merchant gossip of the city markets. Here, surrounded by forest and vineyard, a king could indulge appetites that might raise questions closer to the capital. The palace staff numbered perhaps 200 souls. 50 were women: kitchen maids, laundresses, chamberlains, pralines, seamstresses. They came from surrounding villages, recruited young, housed in dormitories above the kitchens and below the royal apartments. The medieval palace was not the sanitized ceremonial space we imagine today. It was cramped, intimate, and absolutely hierarchical. A king moved through these spaces freely. A servant had nowhere to go that his authority did not reach. Church law officially forbade fornication outside marriage, but that same church recognized that kings operated under different rules. Confessors to the crown understood that royal sins required delicate handling. After all, who would dare refuse absolution to God's anointed? The price was merely penance, prayers, perhaps a charitable donation, never true accountability. But in the winter of 1197, one French king would discover that some solutions to inconvenient problems create horrors that even divine right cannot conceal forever. He ascended to the throne at 23 years old, taking the crown from a father who had died of fever during a disastrous campaign against the English. The Coronation Chronicles describe him as tall, powerfully built, with the characteristic dark hair and stern features of his lineage. He had been raised for kingship, tutored in Latin, trained in warfare, schooled in the elaborate rituals that separated royalty from common mortality, but he had not been raised to exercise restraint. Within his own domains, his word was absolute law. He controlled appointments to every position, judged every dispute, commanded every resource. The Loire Valley Palace became his favoured residence almost immediately. Here, away from the scrutinising gaze of the Paris court and the whispered judgments of the Queen's household, he could live as he wished. The palace records from his first year on the throne show the expansion of the household staff. More kitchen workers hired, more chambermaids appointed, more laundresses brought in from the villages. The steward's accounts note increased expenditure on servants' quarters, on additional food supplies, on fabric for new livery. The king, it seemed, took great interest in his domestic arrangements. The first pregnancy was recorded in the household rolls in the spring of his second year as king. A kitchen maid, 17 years old, daughter of a miller from the nearby village. The entry is brief. Marie, scullery, with child, moved to upper dormitory. There is no mention of marriage, no recording of a father's name, simply a notation that she had been moved to chambers where pregnant servants could be monitored by the palace midwife. 3 months later, the same rolls note her death. Marie died of fever in childbed. Infant also lost, buried in palace cemetery. This was not unusual. Childbirth killed perhaps 1 woman in 5 in medieval France. Infection, hemorrhage, obstructed labour. The medical knowledge to prevent these deaths simply did not exist. The priests said prayers. The midwives did what they could, and women died, their deaths marked only by brief notations in account books. But then came the second pregnancy and the third. By the end of his 3rd year as king, 5 separate entries recorded servant pregnancies. 5 women moved to the upper dormitory, and all 5 dead within weeks of their recorded due dates. All of fever, all with their infants stillborn or perished shortly after birth. The coincidence troubled the palace chaplain, a Benedictine monk who had served the king's father. He raised the matter in confession. The king's response was recorded by the chaplain himself in a private journal discovered centuries later in an abbey archive. His Majesty showed no concern. He stated that servant women were of weak constitution. He suggested I pray for their souls and trouble myself no further with household matters. What the chaplain did not know, what no one outside the king's intimate circle knew, was that these were not random tragedies. They were solutions to a problem that threatened the king's carefully managed image of divine authority. Each of those women had lain with the king, some willingly dazzled by royal attention, others less so. Medieval law did not recognize the concept of a servant refusing her lord's demands. To do so would be disobedience, grounds for dismissal, or worse. When a king desired a woman in his household, that woman had no recourse, no protection, no voice. But pregnancy created complications. It generated talk among the servants, gossip in the villages, questions from visiting nobles. It risked the queen's displeasure. Most dangerously, it created living proof of the king's appetites, children who might survive to adulthood, who might whisper of their parentage, who might become inconvenient reminders that God's anointed was still merely a man. The king needed those reminders to disappear. The solution came from his closest advisor, a nobleman who had accompanied him since childhood. The details are lost. No one recorded the conversation where the plan was proposed, but the result appears in the palace construction accounts from the king's 4th year of reign, a notation of stonework in the palace undercroft, the sealing of an old cistern, the installation of a new iron door with locks that only the king's steward possessed keys to open. What he didn't know was that the palace chaplain, deeply troubled by the pattern of deaths, had begun keeping a secret record of his own, one that would survive in abbey archives long after the king himself had turned to dust. The pattern accelerated. Palace household accounts from the king's 5th through 10th years of reign show a disturbing rhythm. Each spring and autumn, new young women appeared on the employment rolls. Kitchen staff primarily, girls from villages within a day's walk of the palace, daughters of tenant farmers, millers, blacksmiths, families who could not refuse when the royal steward appeared with an offer of palace employment. These women arrived with hope. Palace service meant regular meals, a roof overhead, perhaps even a small wage to send home to struggling families. They scrubbed pots in the vast kitchens. They carried water from the wells. They beat carpets and scoured floors and tended the endless fires that kept the stone palace habitable through brutal winters. And they caught the king's eye. The palace midwife's testimony, preserved in the later ecclesiastical investigation, provides the most detailed account of what followed. She was an older woman, a widow who had attended births in the region for 30 years before being appointed to palace service. Her statement, dictated to the bishop's secretary in her final illness, describes the system with terrible clarity. When a servant woman missed her monthly courses, she was brought to the midwife's chambers for examination. If pregnancy was confirmed, the woman was moved immediately to the upper dormitory. These chambers, located directly above the king's private apartments, could only be accessed through a single guarded door. The women lived there, the midwife testified, under constant watch. They received adequate food and were excused from labour. On the surface, it appeared the king was showing unusual charity to servants in delicate condition. But the midwife noted something else. None of these women ever saw their families again. No visitors were permitted. Letters were not allowed. They existed in a strange suspension, counting the days until their children would be born, and counting, though they did not know it, the days until their deaths. The midwife was required to keep careful records: date of conception, estimated date of birth, the woman's health throughout pregnancy. Each month she reported to the king's steward. The records were meticulous. They had to be. The king needed to know precisely when each birth would occur. As the pregnancies neared term, the women would be moved one final time. All was at night. All was accompanied by the steward and 2 guards the king personally selected, men whose loyalty had been purchased with land grants and titles. The midwife was instructed to follow with her birthing supplies. They descended into the palace under croft, down stone stairs worn smooth by centuries of feet, past the wine cellars and grain storage rooms, to a section of the underground that the midwife had never seen in all her years of service. There was a door, her testimony states, heavy iron, with locks that required 3 separate keys. Beyond it, a chamber, an old cistern that had been partially refilled with water. The stone floor sloped downward to a pool perhaps 5 feet deep. The water was very cold. I could hear it lapping against the walls in the torchlight. This was where the women were brought to give birth. In the cold and damp, attended only by the midwife and watched by the guards. The midwife would do her work, assisting the labour, delivering the child, cutting the cord, and then the steward would take the infant, still slick with birth blood, and ask a single question: does it draw breath? If the child was stillborn, as many were, given the stress and conditions, its small body would be wrapped in cloth and placed in a stone alcove built into the chamber wall. The mother would be helped back up the stairs, told she had lost her child to the will of God, given a few days to recover before being reassigned to kitchen duties. Most accepted this. Infant death was common enough that sorrow outweighed suspicion. But if the child lived, the midwife's testimony becomes less clear here. She speaks of being sent from the chamber, of hearing cries that stopped abruptly, of being summoned back to find the water disturbed, the torches extinguished, and no sign of mother or child. She was told they had been taken to the palace cemetery for burial, the death attributed to childbed fever, the universal explanation for any maternal mortality. She was told never to speak of what she had seen. She was given gold coins, enough to buy a farm. She was promised that if she remained silent, she would want for nothing for the rest of her life. and she was warned, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding what would happen if she broke that silence. Over the course of 5 years, the midwife estimated she attended perhaps 60 births in that underground chamber. She remembered the dates recorded in her private ledger, dates she later provided to the investigating bishop. Cross-referenced with household employment records, a pattern emerged that turned the stomach. Approximately half of those 60 women never appeared in palace records again after their recorded pregnancy. No reassignment to duties, no dismissal noted, no marriage or death recorded. They simply vanished from the accounts as though they had never existed. And the midwife, who had seen them brought down to that chamber, who had heard their labours and delivered their living children, knew exactly what had happened. The water in that sealed cistern had served a purpose after all, not for drinking, not for washing, but for erasing mistakes, for drowning evidence, for ensuring that no bastard child would ever threaten the purity of the royal line, and no servant woman would ever live to speak of what the king had done. But one victim would prove different from all the others. One witness would survive the night that marked the end of this systematic horror, the night when patience and secrecy finally gave way to rage and mass murder. Her name was Isabeau. She was 16 years old when she entered palace service as a scullery maid, the youngest of 7 children from a village less than a league from the palace walls. She could neither read nor write, but she was strong and willing, and those qualities made her valuable in the vast kitchens that fed the royal household. She worked in the shadows of the kitchen, stoking fires, hauling water, scrubbing the massive iron pots that stained her hands black. The work was brutal, but it fed her family. Each month she sent half her wages home. It was enough to keep her younger siblings from starvation. She had been at the palace 9 months when the whispers began. Women in the dormitory spoke in hushed voices about the upper chambers, about friends who had been moved there and never came back, about the midwife's late-night summons, about the king's gaze, which could mean the end of everything. Isabeau tried to stay invisible. She kept her head down, her eyes on her work, but invisibility was impossible when the king decided to see you. It happened during a feast. She had been called up from the kitchens to help serve, an honour that filled her with dread. She moved through the great hall carrying platters of roasted meat, trying not to meet anyone's gaze. But the king saw her. He always saw the young ones. Within a month she missed her courses. Within 2, the midwife's examination confirmed what Isabeau already knew with sick certainty. She was moved to the upper chambers that same day. The lying-in rooms were comfortable enough, clean beds, warm fires, adequate food, but the door was locked from the outside. The single window looked out over an inner courtyard 30 feet below. The other women in the chamber, 6 of them, all in various stages of pregnancy, spoke little. Fear hung in the air like the smoke from the fireplace. Isabeau made friends with one woman, Maurice, who was further along in her term. Marie had worked in the laundry. She was 19 years old and had a husband in the village, a marriage arranged before she entered palace service. "He'll take me back," Marie whispered at night. "After the child comes, they'll let me go back to him." But 3 weeks later, Marie went into labour. The guards came at midnight. The midwife was summoned, and Marie was taken down to the chamber beneath the palace. She never returned. The next morning, the steward informed the remaining women that Marie had died of childbed fever. Her body had been buried, her family notified. It was God's will. They should pray for her soul. Isabeau did not believe him. None of them did. But what could they do? They were locked in, guarded, completely at the mercy of men who answered only to the king. As her own time approached, Isabeau made a decision. When the labour pains began, she would not call for help. She would delay as long as possible. She would find a way to survive, but she could not have anticipated what happened on the night of the 17th of November, in the king's 13th year of reign. That was the night everything ended. Not because conscience finally stirred, but because efficiency demanded it. The king was leaving. Political necessity called him to Paris for the winter season. He would not return to the Loire Palace for months, perhaps longer. And upstairs, in the lying-in chambers, 9 women waited in various stages of pregnancy. 9 problems that needed solving before the king departed. 9 witnesses to his appetites. 9 potential sources of scandal. 9 wombs carrying children who bore his blood and threatened his legitimacy. The steward received his orders. The guards were assembled. The midwife was summoned. And Isabeau, hiding in the shadows of the kitchen, where she had slipped away during a moment of guard inattention, watched as all 9 women were brought down from the upper chambers and led into the undercroft. Her testimony would reach ears she never expected. But first, she had to survive the night that would haunt her for the remaining 40 years of her life. Isabeau pressed herself into the shadows behind the great fireplace in the kitchen, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it would betray her. Through the gap where the chimney met the wall, she could see the entrance to the undercroft. Torches descended the stairs, one after another. She counted 9 flames, 9 women. She heard screams, terrible screams that the stone walls could not entirely muffle. They lasted perhaps an hour. Then silence fell, more horrible than any sound. When the guards finally emerged, their clothes were soaked. They carried empty torches. The steward followed last, locking the iron door behind him with 3 separate keys. Isabeau watched him slip the keys into a leather pouch and tuck it inside his tunic. She waited until the palace slept, then she ran. The village priest found her at dawn, collapsed at his door, sobbing and incoherent. He brought her inside, gave her water, and slowly drew out the story. But what could he do? Accuse a king? Challenge divine authority? The priest was old, practical, and terrified. He gave Isabeau money and told her to run, to disappear into another village, another life, to forget what she had seen. She tried. For 40 years she tried. But in her final illness, lying in a cottage far from the Loire Valley, Isabeau sent for a priest, not to confess her sins, she had none that mattered, but to confess the king's. She dictated her testimony slowly, carefully, while the priest wrote every word. When she finished, she made him swear to deliver the letter to the Bishop of Paris. "Someone must... Oh, no?" she whispered. "Someone must remember them." She died that night. The priest kept his promise. The letter reached Bishop Maurice 100 years later, moving through tens of hands. He read it twice, then locked it in his private chest while he considered what to do. Accuse a king long dead? Open wounds that time had sealed? But the details in Isabeau's testimony haunted him. The specific dates, the names of women she had known, the description of the underground chamber. Maurice began a quiet investigation. He examined palace records, cross-referenced household accounts, interviewed elderly servants who had worked at the Loire Palace decades before. A pattern emerged that confirmed every word of Isabeau's letter. He petitioned Rome for permission to conduct a formal ecclesiastical investigation. It took 2 years to receive approval. The king in question had been dead nearly a century, and the church moved slowly when confronting royal sins. But finally, armed with papal authority, Maurice travelled to the Loire Valley with a company of investigators. The palace had been abandoned for decades, fallen into disrepair after the royal court moved to more fashionable residences, but the undercroft remained intact, and when Maurice's men broke open the sealed iron door, they found exactly what Isabeau had described. The water had never been drained, the bodies had never been removed. 50 women and their unborn children still rested in that flooded tomb, silent witnesses to a king's monstrous solution to an inconvenient truth. The king himself was beyond earthly justice. He had died in his bed, shriven and blessed, his sins confessed and absolved by a confessor who knew better than to refuse royal pardon. His tomb in the cathedral at Reims bore an inscription praising his piety and devotion to God. Bishop Maurice sent his full report to Rome with a personal letter requesting that the king's body be exhumed and denied Christian burial. The response came 6 months later. The Pope acknowledged the horror of what had been discovered. He expressed sorrow for the victims. He ordered prayers said for their souls, but he would not disturb a royal tomb. The reasoning was political, pragmatic, and infuriatingly typical of how the church balanced divine justice against earthly power. The king in question had been dead for a century. His descendants still sat on the throne of France. To declare him a murderer, to deny him Christian burial, would destabilize the very institution of kingship. It would suggest that royal divine right could be revoked, that kings could be judged by earthly authorities. The implications were too dangerous. Instead, the Pope ordered the chamber sealed again. A chapel was built above it, consecrated to the memory of the forgotten servants of the crown. Masses were said, a small plaque was installed, mentioning nothing of murder, speaking only of the souls who rest beneath this sacred ground. The full truth was buried in the Vatican archives, where it remained for 5 more centuries. It was not until a 19th century historian stumbled upon Bishop Maurice's report while researching medieval royal households that the story finally emerged into public knowledge. By then it was merely history, a curiosity, a footnote to the long catalogue of royal abuses that characterized medieval Europe. But for those 50 women, there was no footnote adequate to their suffering. We do not know most of their names. The household records that survived list only a handful: Marie, Isabeau, Agnes, Marguerite, Catherine. The rest are simply numbers in account books, anonymous victims of a system that treated them as property and their lives as expendable. They were daughters and sisters. Some had husbands waiting in villages, wondering why their wives never returned from palace service. Some had children who grew up asking what happened to mother. All had families who were told lies, who were given small payments in compensation, who were expected to grieve quietly and ask no questions. Their bodies still rest beneath that chapel floor. The Loire Palace is a ruin now, open to tourists who walk its corridors without knowing the horror that lies beneath their feet. The chapel stands, its plaque worn smooth by centuries of weather. No one remembers to say prayers for them anymore. No one except those who seek out the darkest corners of history and refuse to let the forgotten remain forgotten. These victims' names echo through centuries. Honour their memory by exploring more untold histories on this channel. The next story is even darker. If you dare,